Good morning, boys and girls. Happy Monday. It is Monday. What's today's date? May 18th. This week for e-learning, all you have to do is catch up. Mrs. C and I are not going to be putting any assignments up on EdSP anymore. We're working on some other things for you to end our school year. So you just relax, listen to the read alouds, and catch up on any work or assignments that you might have missed or not had time for. Okay, the story we're going to share with you today is called Make Way for Ducklings. It's one of my favorite stories that we read around springtime about ducks that live in a pond. The author is Robert McCloskey. Make Way for Ducklings. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live, but every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There were sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles. So they flew on. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. The very place to spend the night, quacked Mr. Mallard. So down they flapped. The next morning, they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find too much. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer, but the people on his boat threw peanuts into the water, so the Mallards followed them all around the pond and got another breakfast, better than the first. Can you see the bird that the Mallards tried to talk to? Why do you think that bird didn't answer? Maybe it wasn't a real duck? Maybe it was just a statue on the boat? "I like this place," said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed out on its bank and waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right here in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. I mean, what could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard. Delighted, at last, Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. But, "Look out," squawked Mrs. Mallard, all of a dither. "You'll get run over." And when she caught her breath, she added, "Oh, this is no place for my babies. With all those horrid things rushing about, we'll have to look somewhere else." It was a bike, kids on bikes, and around the park. She didn't like that very much. So they flew over Beacon Hill and round the State House, but there was no place there. They looked in Louisburg Square, but there was nowhere there for them to swim. Then they flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mr. Mallard. "That island looks like a nice, quiet place, and it's only a little ways away from the public garden." Yes, said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. That looks like just the right place to hatch our ducklings. So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water, and they settled down to build their nest. And only just in time for now, they were beginning to molt. That means that their feathers were beginning to come off. All their old wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. But of course, they could swim, and one day they swam over the park on the riverbank, and there they met a policeman named Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that, the Mallards called on Michael every day. Remember, they can't fly anymore because they molted, so they can only walk and swim. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't go visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs and keep them warm. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water, or to have lunch, or to count her eggs to make sure all her babies were there. One day the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then Cack, then Lack, then Mack, then Knack, then Ack, and Pack, and Quack. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. Can you see the babies? One day, Mr. Mallard decided that he'd like to take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like. So off he set. I'll see you in 1 week in the public garden, he quacked over his shoulder. Take good care of the ducklings. Don't you worry, said Mrs. Mallard. I know all about bringing up children. She taught them how to swim and how to dive. She taught them to walk in a line too, and to come whenever they were called, and to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." Before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Ack, Pack, and Quack fell just in line, just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. There, they waded ashore and waddled along until they came to the highway. Uh-oh. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. Honk, honk, went the horns on the speeding cars. Quack, went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. Quack, 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 went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Ack, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by, and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on quacking. Uh-oh, I hope they don't get hurt. They made such a noise that Michael came running over, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. He planted himself in the center of the road. He raised one hand to stop the traffic, and then he beckoned with the other hand, the way that police officers do, for Mrs. Mallard and her ducklings to cross over. Oh, good thing Michael was there. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to his police booth. He called Clancy at headquarters and said, "There's a family of ducklings walking down the street," Clancy said. "Family of what?" "Ducks," yelled Michael. "Send a police car, quick." Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned into Charles Street with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mac, Knack, Ack, Pack, and Quack all marching in line behind her. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Isn't that amazing?" And the man who swept the streets said, "Well now, ain't that nice?" And when Mrs. Mallard heard, she was so proud. She tipped her nose in the air and she walked along with a little extra swing in her waddle. When they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was the police car with 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The policemen held back and the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings could march across the street. And you see them, they're tiny, but see they're going across the street here, and there's all the police cars that stopped the traffic, thanks to Michael, who called headquarters to let them know that this duck family was coming. And they marched right into the public garden. Inside the gate, they all turned around to say thank you to the policeman. The policeman smiled and waved goodbye. When they reached the pond and they swam across to the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he had promised. The ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there. All day long, they follow the swan boats and they eat the peanuts. So they did decide to live there. And remember that swan from the beginning of the story? It was really just a statue on the boat. This story takes place in Boston. And when you go to Boston, these are real places in Boston, Massachusetts. And there really are swan boats that take visitors and travelers all around the pond and all around the public garden. It's really pretty. So that swan was not a bird that Mrs. Mallard or the Mallards could talk to. It was just a statue on the swan boat. And when night falls, they swim to their little island, and that's their home, and they go to sleep. I hope you liked the story, Make Way for Ducklings. Like I said earlier, boys and girls, today's Monday, and we are starting our 8th week of e-learning. However, this week, we are just gonna ask you to catch up and make sure that you're practicing your sight words. You should have picked up your sight word folder in your materials bag that you were working on. So make sure you're working on your sight words. Make sure that you're reading every day. Every day, practice your reading. Use your reading strategies. They are posted, they are pinned up on Edsby in the corner of the language arts class. So make sure you can use those reading strategy cards. Make sure you're practicing your strategies and your reading. For math, anything on Pearson that you maybe have not done, if you want to go back and catch up on that, that would be great. But other than that, just enjoy your days with your family, read, and catch up on some work assignments this week. That's it. I love you, I miss you, and I will see you soon. Bye.